Hello YouTube, Matthew here, and in today's video, I want to first of all welcome you to 2025, because it's likely when you're seeing this video, if you're closer to the upload date than otherwise. And I'd also like to say that this video will cover digital forensics and how we as forensic examiners take a look at the hardware of the computers that we seize and that we analyze on our own. So with that out of the way, and without further ado, let's roll the intro and get into the video. So welcome back to the video. So the title of this video is going to be Digital Forensics and the Hardware That We See. So in today's goals, we are going to classify the hardware that we have, go over what a physical hard disk is, see how a hard disk is physically constructed and how computers read them, and also we'll do the same with SSDs and RAM, albeit in a slightly more conceptual manner, because I didn't have any good figures for this. So now, first of all, let's go over the history of storage media. So at the beginning of all computers, we had punch cards, which have been around a lot before digital computers. And what these punch cards would do is you would punch out whatever program that you were doing on the cards, as you can see right there in the picture. As you can see, these holes were punched by some puncher, and you would feed these cards in one by one into the machine, and in doing so, the machine would read them and would give some sort of calculation out. And the full program might take a few hours or even a few days to do. And at the end of everything, you may get an answer that is either right or wrong. And if it's wrong, it was very expensive within terms of time and money to rerun this program, correcting any mistakes that you made. So we ended up needing some other ways to do it. So then things like vacuum tubes and vacuum type memory were invented. And that made things faster, but it was still pretty slow. And drum memory was one of these types of vacuum type data storage mechanisms. So basically, it's just a magnetic drum that is able to store data inside it, and it's not really becoming of everything, if of anything, but one thing that is magnetic tape. And actually, the story of magnetic tape is very interesting, because in many of the classic computer science experiments that have been done, magnetic tape is one of the things that was conceptualized. So what magnetic tape did for us is it stored all the data on a sequential magnetic tape. So if a computer were reading from this, it would do something along the lines of going from each part of the tape to the next, to the next, to the next, until it found the data, and that could take quite a while. So we'll have to fast forward a little bit to the 60s and 70s to see this right here, which you guys all must know by now, which is the hard disk drive. And the hard disk drive is another type of magnetic medium, but it's very much so physical magnetic medium, because as you'll see later, there's many magnetic disks or platters that go inside the disks of this hard disk drive, and they spin at a very high speed. And with this high speed, there is a needle that reads them going from between the grooves of the disks at a very fast speed as well. And in doing that, it's able to find the data in a less sequential manner than on the tape or even by previous methods of storage like drum memory. And this, although this is correct, it feels sort of out of order because floppy disks are another thing that we've seen. And that for those of you older people watching this, you may remember from the late 80s or even during the 90s in like installing Windows on your computer via multiple floppy disks that probably held only up to 5 megabytes of storage on that floppy disk or anything along those lines. But anyways, floppy disks were sort of like the disks within hard drives, but they were made out of plastic. And the thing with those is that they were very very fragile and like I said also stored much less data than even hard drives would store, because whereas you can get maybe a few megabytes off of a hard drive, you could get, sorry, a floppy disk, you could get multiple gigabytes off of a hard drive, and that also made it more expensive to run hard drives. And the hard drives of today are solid state medium, and as you can see here, the SSD chip is very small compared to the hard drive. And if you were holding a hard drive in your hands, it might be much thicker and maybe even longer than the SSD. And that is because, again, physical disks and all of the stuff that needs to go into it to store it is very big. But in our case, with right here with the SSDs, it's much easier to carry this, and you could probably carry this in your pocket within some sort of enclosure. Because I think basically all that you have is some very small die with the storage on it, a controller, and probably some sort of DRAM. Actually, this is probably the controller. This is the storage chip, and this is probably DRAM right here. If any of you guys watching this are watching this, and I made a mistake on that, please let me know. But the main, as you'll see later, the three main parts of an SSD that an SSD can be composed of are this, most likely this being the actual area where the storage parts of it are, a controller and a DRAM. Now with that out of the way, let's move on to storage media from our perspective as an analyst of forensics. So physical storage is basically just the physical media itself, which is your hard drive, your SSD, your RAM if you can get it to if you can get the data to stay, maybe a flash drive, maybe a Blu-ray, CD, DVD disc, or any other thing that you may find like an SD card or some sort of storage chip somewhere else. And logical storage is our computer's abstraction of what's inside the disk itself. So it's just a data organization. And this will be how the OS reads our data and information that we have stored on the disk and interprets it. So it can be interpreted by something like a file allocation table, which looks at all the parts of the disk and interprets all these parts and breaks these parts down and spreads files across these parts so that it can be stored easily and recalled easily as well. So when it comes to storage, these are some of the terminologies that we use. So we have a sector and a cluster. And sectors are the physical divisions, and clusters are the basic logical divisions of these storage media. So sectors are divided into 512 bytes each, most likely. Just check the spec of your computer and the actual drive that you're looking at, just to make sure that it's 512, but it's most likely 512. And so clusters, being the basic unit of logical memory accessible to the OS, they can read up to or at least one sector. So sometimes clusters can read more than one sector based on if the data is spread out or striped across multiple sectors, but one sector is the bare minimum. And when it comes to logical data, the OS organizes logical data into a file table, which is either a master file table or file allocation table. And these are just different ways of seeing it. And rows in this table will represent the clusters that we just defined in the previous slides. And logical clusters can also represent many physical sectors. So again, this could be if the data is stored across one cluster of data, which is multiple multiple parts of data striped across the disk. And this can be in multiple places on the disk as well, which is why multiple physical sectors is here. Because again, sometimes when you're looking at a hard disk, at least, this may change for things like solid state and RAM, but when you're looking at a hard disk, since we have the needle spinning across multiple places looking for places to put the data, if the data if you finally find a place to put the data, you just put it there. And if this is with if the data is more than the threshold of space there, the needle will look for it again, look for another place again, and store it there. So this may put it at different parts of the disk. And this is what leads to something that is the bane of our existence, which is fragmentation. And fragmentation is kind of bad because it reduces it makes us take more time to find the full file that we want to find to be able to pull back up and display to our user. So if we have incredible solutions to make fragmentation less, or maybe even not at all, that will be good for us. And this can be something that happens with other storage media, which we'll see later on. And one thing that can happen with this is residual data, and residual data across every single type of storage medium is data that is logically deleted but not physically gone. So logically deleted means that if we have a basic pointer to the place, the basic pointer will not show up, but the garbage collection or whatever mechanism that we have to actually remove the data from that place has not been set to go to that place, and it is still there. So this residual data can either be contained in file slack or unallocated storage. So what file slack is, as you'll see going forward, is if we have a certain if we have a certain cluster of data in our logical place, that can be a certain amount of bytes, and a certain amount of bytes can be stored by something. But if it is not exactly equal to that amount of storage space will have some file slack associated with it. And unallocated storage for us is just storage that we have not allocated, whether it's deleted or not used at all within any type of storage partition or out of storage partitions of the disk. So now let's get into the anatomy of our hard disk here. So again, like I said here, hard disks or hard drive geometry is made of various different platters of disks, and these disks spin at a very high speed. So things that, or our hard drives of today, spin at either 5800 or 7200 rate spins per minute. And this is very fast, and it allows us to have a somewhat super fast ability to read data off of them. And at least to the human eye, this is good. But if you're looking at computer time, this is going to be extremely, extremely slow compared to a solid state drive, which is purely magnetic and goes off a charge, as well as RAM, and even loads and loads of orders slower than CPU time. So in these pictures here, you can see that there are multiple storage platters here, and each platter has its own read arm. And these read arms strategically look for places on the platters and on the platters to store memory, and they can also be used to read the stuff from the disk. And so these arms are called the read-write head, and on the other side of it is our head positioning mechanism, which helps us position the head onto a part of the disk. And all of these disks are put in within a sealed chamber, and this sealed chamber is what protects our disks from magnetic interference, and which keeps heat away from the disks. Because again, with these disks spinning, it can create a lot of heat, and heat will wear down the disk, so having sealing it within a chamber can help us with heat. And we also do need a logic board so that the computer can interface with it, and so that it can do its own calculations to find the perfect places on a disk to put things, and it can retrieve things if it needs to, or if it's been requested to do so. So now when it comes to solid state and flash technology, it's more of a super fast magnetic storage. And it's super fast because it uses charges of it uses electromagnetic charges instead of a read-write head to flip the bits and store data. And so data, unlike in other methods, is stored within our solid state memory as a 0 bit. And this is because it uses a NAND flash, and dynamic RAM uses some sort of NAND gate. And this NAND gate, instead of having a 1 as the charged bit, it uses a 0 as a charged bit. And so when data is actually stored, it will be stored in this 0 bit. And what actually happens with this is when data is stored in our NAND modules are more flexible. So if we have multiple NAND chips, we will have more storage. And so this configuration right here would have a lot of storage to it. So maybe we can associate this maybe with a terabyte. And so NAND flash will also be non-volatile, which is good for us because like the hard drive, we can store things on this for a long time. So now as long as this has charge, or as long as all of the modules in our NAND have charge to them in each of their little NAND cells, we'll be able to store stuff on here for long times, maybe 20 to even up to 100 years. And something that you might like to know is that NAND also uses wear leveling to distribute our read-write operations across the NAND modules, so that one NAND module will not experience too much wear compared to other ones over the lifetime of the solid state drive. And so when it comes to our SSD, the controller is the brains of this operation, and so it is what actually performs the wear leveling operations on the NAND flashes and controls where data goes onto these flashes. And it also handles our garbage collection. So when something is deleted off of these drives, the controller will allocate and deallocate the space based on whatever we see here. And it also handles block management across the NANDs. So whatever data blocks are being used to store data, it knows where everything is and knows where to put things. And it also controls, so our controller will also help us control the power that goes across the NANDs, and it'll flip the bits too. And so when it comes to the DRAM, not all solid states have a DRAM, but what a DRAM does for those that do is it stores metadata on the files that are within that drive. It also optimizes performance of these NANDs. It does some write buffering so that things that are needed more often can be cached in there, so that these things can be cached in there and so that they can be retrieved faster. And it also helps facilitate a low power state if we need it to be on sleep or in some sort of state that doesn't have all of the power, and it maintains all of the data in the positions that the data are in at the moment. Because again, since this is flash memory, if we lose complete power to all of these NAND flashes, everything will be gone. So that will be a consideration for us to have. And so when it comes to our SSDs, there are certain amounts of data that can be stored on blocks. So each block has a certain amount of cells to it. And these cells are organized in a matter of matrices, and these matrices are again multiplied on top of each other by multiple rows of matrices, and each cell itself can store 1 bit a single data point, a 2 data points, 3 data points, or 4 data points, which is single, double, triple, or quadruple level cells. And if we have more levels per cell, this will decrease the speed of the SSD because it has to read through multiple possible data points to find the data that it wants. But the caveat to that, or rather, if you'd like, our trade-off to that is the less cells that you have, the more expensive the drive will be. So that means single level cells are the most expensive to produce and quad cells are the cheapest. And also when it comes to that, we use transistors to make this operation work. And so when it comes to RAM, a RAM is primary memory, not too far away from the processor. And it is also volatile, since RAM does not have something like this, something like a DRAM chip or methods in order to make the power stay on the flash area of itself. It is thus volatile, meaning that when power is lost, everything in RAM is lost. But what RAM does for us is it can provide a snapshot of our system for us. And it can be helpful for us if we want to pull it out and see what application data was stored, maybe what data was in transit over a network, what programs were running, what keys that we have to authenticate certain apps, or even authenticate into the device, or many other things. And again, it needs power to maintain the state of the system. And if it doesn't have power, we lose it. We lose everything. And so how RAM works for us is that our RAM DIMMs contain NAND chips with multiple matrices worth of memory cells. And like SSDs, single matrices have thousands of rows and columns. And each column of individually cells are calculated by adding current. So, but unlike what we discussed before with our SSDs, our RAM chips are normal. So if we have a current, there's a 1 there. If not, there's a 0. And modern RAM is synchronous and dynamic, or SDRAM. And synchronous the name synchronous is given to it because it's faster to use because it's synced with the system clock. And so the processor can store program data or whatever data it needs to store in RAM for quick retrieval quick retrieval above the caches within our processor anywhere on our RAM chip, and that is why we call it dynamic. So again, we can make further videos going into all of the parts of RAM and why it works the way it does. But for now, the high level interpretation of this is that it's synchronous and dynamic, and it's non-volatile. And moving on, it uses our modern RAM uses a combination of transistors and capacitors to manage charge in its blocks. So transistors are what's used to store energy, and capacitors manage the current flow into the block. So, going back here, if our bit is a 1, you can think of the energy that goes across our medium of energy dispersal like water. So our our capacitor will be like a door to that water. So our if our bit is supposed to be on, since our transistor loses charge relatively quickly in the order of milliseconds, we need to make sure that the capacitor door is opened so that this capacitor door must be open so that energy could flow freely into it. Whereas if the bit is supposed to be a 0, the capacitor door must be closed so that no water gets into it and no water leaks out of it. And like this picture down here, the refresh is based on what the processor does, what the processor makes the RAM do. We can find the amount of refreshes to this RAM on the spec of the RAM itself. So this one that I found here, which is one of the first results for me on the Best Buy store page, is we see here it's 6,000 megahertz, which is 6 billion times per second that this thing refreshes. So it refreshes super quickly, and that makes it very fast for us to read from and to write to. Now, more storage terminology. So the highest level organization of our disks and drives are volumes or unused space. So volumes come to us when we actually allocate the space to something. So on the computer or phone that you're watching this on, one of the volumes or partitions of that device will be the partition with the operating system on it, which is probably a smaller amount compared to the user partition, which is where all the data is stored. And these volumes by themselves are also organized into smaller subdivisions, which are allocated clusters, which is space used by all types of files, unallocated structure, which is space not used by any files or data structures, and like I said earlier, slack space, which is the space between clusters that are not used by files. And RAM slack is the type of slack space within RAM, and drive slack is the type of slack that we can find in hard drives, flash media storage, and solid state drives, just to name a few of them. And when it comes to logical volume technology, logical volumes will allow us to split our drives into many volumes and partitions. And so say in this figure we have a logical volumes here off a 1 terabyte hard drive. So this may not be something totally resembling what your computer operating system might have for it, but it's something maybe for a secondary storage device to the main drive that we have our system stored on. So we've split this into something like 512 gigabytes of storage volume for some types of files, and a quarter of or half of that for other stuff, and that leaves 256 or another half of that, or a quarter of the overall storage space unallocated to be allocated for other things. So as you can see here with that, you can do an infinite amount of swapping around with the space, but once you have a volume allocated, you can store stuff on there. And again, you can always change the sizes of these volumes and leave less or more unallocated space, but this is just a basic rundown of what this would kind of look like for us. And these are two examples of file tables that we have from earlier. So with this on a file table, we can have something like, our computer will read it something like clusters, file names, extensions, and maybe where else it continues. So on the one on the right, we might find, if we're looking at the table for cluster 3280, we'll find a secret.doc that starts there, and it also ends at that one too, because it's smaller than the cluster. And however, at 3281, our homework.docx lives there and starts there. And homework.docx is bigger than the cluster size, so we allocate it to this space right here, 3282. And it again spills over to 3285, and 3285 is the end of that file. And again, we'll have something like a checkbook.excel spreadsheet, and that will be held in one single cluster. And same goes for these, but I created a table with ChatGPT here with a bit more data to it. So a file table can also contain things like this, like things that you would see on your Windows File Explorer, which are like the file size in kilobytes and whatever time it was created, and other stuff like that. But yeah, that's just a basic rundown of this. And so when it comes to file select, again, just for visual representation of this, this will be like at something like sector 3280 of a disk. And we have multiple sectors here, so 4 sectors within this cluster. And so it'll have something like a sentence like, I ate lunch under the car. And there might have been something deleted right here. And so there's slack right here for, there may be RAM slack right here, and this will be under drive slack because all of this stuff was deleted too. All of this stuff was possibly deleted. And if it was deleted, it would be drive slack. So if you remember back to one of my last videos, I talked about the storage file system types, and I mentioned FAT32, exFAT, and NTFS. Well, let me go over that again really quickly. So throughout the life cycle of Windows, there has been different types of file systems that a Windows machine can have. For instance, FAT16 and FAT32 were big file system types during the 90s. And NTFS has been around with us since the early 90s in Windows NT in 1993. And what FAT stands for actually is file allocation table. And these file allocation tables live with us at the root of our file system in the FAT system. And these help file systems index and keep track of the files on the drive. And the main difference between FAT32 and FAT16 is that FAT32 is double the size of bits of a file allocation table entry. And so that means that it virtually doubles the abilities of FAT16. And how this converts for us is that FAT32 can store up to 2 terabytes on a volume and up to 4 gigabytes in a certain file, as opposed to half of that on FAT16. And These file systems can assign properties to files and folders, and they also assign 3-letter file extensions to these files with a certain amount of bits in FAT. And one of the main limitations of FAT32 was the fact that only 4 gigabytes can be stored on a file. So one of the main fun parts of using that file system on maybe a flash drive or something these days is that if you want to store some sort of big file like maybe a game or a sort of image on that and it's FAT32, you won't be able to, and you'll have to reformat it as exFAT or NTFS. And if you format it as NTFS, just to be putting it between Windows systems and Windows systems, you'll be able to store something like a few exabytes worth of data, which is a virtually infinite amount on a single file. And so let me move on to NTFS now and tell you ways that it's better than FAT. So again, like I said, we have larger volumes and larger file sizes supported. So if I could pull up the file table from one of the last videos, you'll be able to see that there's way bigger a file, way bigger of a file size. And there's also an enhanced security in NTFS because it allows for us to do things like what's it called? So it allows us to do things like user access control and BitLocker, among other things, for enhanced security. And volume striping is another thing that it allows us to do. So what that does for us is it allows us to put volumes across multiple drives, and that could be helpful if we're doing something like a RAID array, which allows us to stripe our data across multiple files or multiple drives. And file compression is another thing that it allows us to do, as well as it has a master file table as opposed to the file allocation table of the previous two that we talked about. Now, when it comes to the master file table, again, it is the NTFS equivalent of our FAT file table, and it stores data about the files on the systems, and it even MFT entries store data even on the MFT itself, and it is also very helpful for us forensically, because with many things that are either deleted or still alive, it can tell us all the properties of the files that we have. So in essence, it will it can be very helpful for us in the case that we have deleted files, because since it tells us all of the properties of these files on the system, it can tell us exactly where it was, when it was created, how it was created, what programs used it, and how big it was, among other things. And MFT records can be anywhere from 1 to 4 kilobytes long, and they can store attributes like the attributes found in this picture below. So you can see here that it stores a file name and file extensions, and I believe right here these things right here are probably about timestamps, and also name of the file again. And yeah, the NTFS master file table is a challenge among itself to cover, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to dedicate a whole video or series of videos to doing that. But for now, I'd like to say thank you for watching, and if you have any questions about this, but you haven't watched any of my videos after this, if you're watching this in the far future, please ask questions in the comment section. But if not, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope this warrants a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. And if it does, I hope to see you again soon, and have a great day. And if you're watching this early in the new year. Happy New Year to you, and I hope you stick along for many more videos to come. And with that out of the way, Matthew signing off. Till next time, Matt.